In a nationally televised hearing, Jasmine Crockett and Kimberly Klacik collide in a battle that redefines what it means to help or to harm. One believes government aid is overdue justice. The other calls it a trap dressed as compassion. From the very first exchange, the room ignites. Personal insults, haunting testimonies, and decades of pain unfold like a courtroom war. But as one woman holds up a fading photo of survival and the other presents a polished vision of escape, the clash turns from political to personal. When two black women fight for freedom on opposite sides of the system, who really holds the key? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The chamber of Congress buzzed with tension as C-SPAN's red light blinked on the screen above the panel. The words glared: social welfare, lifeline or chain. The audience was a volatile mix: civil rights groups, national media, education investors, and black parents from struggling communities. Every seat was full. No one was neutral. Jasmine Crockett, in a dark tailored suit, walked in first. Calm but alert. Her eyes swept the room: activists, organizers, and people who had lived the policies being debated here. She knew this wasn't just a hearing. It was a battlefield disguised in marble and microphones, and she was walking into a chamber where compassion was often dismissed as weakness. Then came the contrast, deliberate and theatrical. Kimberly Klacik followed moments later, heels sharp, smile tight, dressed in striking red. She made her presence known like a warning flare. To her supporters, she was the anti-establishment voice who had called welfare the leash that keeps Black America obedient. Behind her, aides queued up footage of failing schools and food stamp lines. She didn't come to argue. She came to expose. As the moderator announced their names, the room fell silent. Two women. Two truths. One believing in the system, one determined to burn it down. The hearing began not with civility, but with a cold, familiar war. The silence didn't break. It constricted. It wrapped itself around the chamber like wire humming beneath the surface, daring someone to move first. The moment felt like the top of a breath that never released. Journalists leaned forward. A staffer stopped typing. And somewhere in the back, a mother with a notepad folded her hands like a prayer. The moderator's voice had faded into the background, but the red light on the C-SPAN camera was still pulsing. Then Jasmine Crockett spoke, not loud, but with the weight of generations behind her. Social welfare is not a handout, she began, her tone steady, almost deceptively calm. It's the overdue redemption of a system that once wrung entire families dry and left them to rot in silence. Her words didn't drift. They dropped. When government redlined our neighborhoods, when banks refused our mortgages, when hospitals turned away our grandmothers, welfare was the only rope thrown to keep us from drowning. She let the sentence hang. Her eyes scanned the room, not for applause, but for witnesses. It's not a gift. It's a receipt. The tension shifted from abstract to electric. Every phrase summoned ghosts, foreclosed homes, denied loans, untreated illnesses, and futures carved out of nothing but resistance. Crockett wasn't reading a policy brief. She was testifying. Across the table, Kimberly Klacik did not frown, did not nod, did not blink. Her expression was made of stone and certainty. She sat with the poise of someone who had waited her entire life for this rebuttal. And when she finally answered, it was with a precision that bordered on cold. Social welfare, she said, hasn't lifted our communities. It's fertilized failure. It's turned ambition into addiction. The rhythm of her voice was deliberate. Each word like a scalpel cutting through rhetoric. Government checks replaced fathers. Food stamps replaced pride. And the worst part? We were told to be grateful for it. There was no pause for reaction. Only a slow pivot of her gaze toward Crockett. And the strike? Jasmine, maybe you haven't lived close enough to poverty to see how government help kills dreams. The words landed like a slap in a funeral hall. A gasp somewhere near the second row. The sharp inhale of someone who felt it cut too close. Crockett's jaw locked. No flinch, no blink, but a flash of something behind her eyes that burned hotter than anger. Memory. She'd seen food pantries that ran out by noon. She'd watched children open empty refrigerators and pretend not to care. And now, in front of millions, she was being told that those ropes were chains, that survival had been a choice. The oxygen in the room thinned. The tension didn't fall. It crystallized. And no one, not one camera, not one heart, looked away. The blow didn't leave a bruise, but it left a scar in the air. Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch, didn't rise to the insult, because she had come armed with more than outrage. She had come armed with evidence. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the folder before her. The paper inside wasn't dramatic, but the truth it held was volcanic. She slid a printed chart across the table so the cameras could capture every grim digit. 73% of Medicaid recipients in Texas, she began, her voice measured and unwavering, are people of color. The room hushed again. No one interrupted. And 38% of them can't afford their mental health prescriptions without that assistance. She paused just long enough for the weight to sink in, for the audience to imagine what it means to ration insulin, to skip antidepressants, to gamble with survival in silence. That's not dependency. That's survival under siege. Behind her, a screen lit up. Bar graphs, state-by-state maps, color-coded data from the Department of Health and Human Services. The pattern was unmistakable. In conservative states like Texas, Florida, Alabama, and Georgia, Black and Latino communities bore the brunt of health inequity, often uninsured, often unheard, often unprotected. Crockett didn't shout. She didn't need to. The numbers did the screaming for her. And the message was ruthless. This wasn't about laziness. It was about legacy. A legacy of being denied care and then blamed for needing it. Across the table, Kimberly Klacik remained poised. Unmoved. Unbothered. If Crockett had brought fire, Klacik would answer with ice. With an almost mechanical precision, she reached for her own set of papers and lifted a laminated bar chart high enough for the front row to see. Her nails clicked against the plastic like a countdown. Do you know what else is consistent? She asked, turning slightly toward the moderator but keeping her eyes on Crockett. She tapped the chart once. The more we spend on housing subsidies, the more we see long-term poverty increase in those exact neighborhoods. The room inhaled, slow and uncertain. Her tone was calculated, not harsh, but sharp enough to cut. We're not solving poverty. We're subsidizing it. We're building scaffolding around the same broken foundation and wondering why it collapses every generation. She gestured to the new visuals behind her, HUD charts, spending trends, slides showing rising public housing budgets and stagnant job growth in inner cities. These programs weren't designed to lift. They were designed to pacify. Then, leaning forward just slightly, she delivered the line that twisted every stomach in the room: it doesn't matter how much you spend if what you plant is dependency. The sentence detonated without raising its voice. Some heads turned in agreement. Others stiffened in disbelief. What was unfolding now wasn't a disagreement. It was a duel between two moral realities, between the ledger and the lived experience, between dignity and the price of being told how to earn it. The tension hadn't just thickened. It had calcified. Every word exchanged so far had been precise, sharp. But what came next would cut deeper than any statistic. Jasmine Crockett stood slowly, not in defiance, but in mourning. With a nod, she signaled to her team, and the lights in the chamber dipped just enough for the screen behind her to flicker to life. What appeared wasn't cinematic. It was real. Images of East Dallas appeared, street by street, sagging rooftops, boarded windows, spray-painted numbers on condemned doors, cracked sidewalks leading nowhere. Children's toys lay half-buried in weeds. A rusted wheelchair sat outside a burned-out duplex. Crockett turned toward the screen, then back to the room. Her voice was quiet, but it carried like thunder under pressure. This asterisk, she said, gesturing with a slow hand, is what disinvestment looks like. She didn't rush her words. She wanted them to sting. We don't live in these conditions because we want to. We live here because the system made sure we had nowhere else to go. She locked eyes with the moderator, then scanned the crowd. Her tone sharpened. No one chooses to raise their child in a house where the ceiling leaks on the crib. It's not that we like relying on assistance. We were forced into needing it. For a moment, it felt like even the cameras held their breath. These weren't talking points. They were photographs of neglect, proof of policies made far away and paid for in ruined neighborhoods. Crockett wasn't just describing poverty. She was showing the aftermath of decisions signed with polished pens but lived through crumbling walls. But Kimberly Klacik didn't shift. She didn't flinch. When she spoke, it was with a calm that almost felt rehearsed, not because it lacked sincerity, but because it had been said so many times before. "I come from Baltimore," she began, her voice lower, tighter, but still poised, where boarded-up buildings are as common as campaign promises. She leaned forward now, elbows on the table, her tone dropping into something colder. "And I've seen firsthand what happens when politicians don't fix poverty. They campaign on it." The words slithered through the air, smooth and devastating. Then, without raising her voice, without breaking eye contact, she fired the line that hollowed out the chamber: "If you want to keep people poor, just keep handing out ballots in exchange for food stamps." The blow didn't echo. It detonated, not with volume, but with venom. The audience stiffened. One woman in the back dropped her pen. Crockett remained standing, but her shoulders tightened, barely, but enough for those watching closely to see. The attack hadn't just undermined her politics. It had branded the very people she fought for as pawns. The photographs on the screen behind her were still there, still burning, still real, but now cast under the shadow of a question that cut to the bone: were they victims or commodities? And in that moment, the hearing turned from testimony into something much harder to watch, and even harder to forget. The wound was still open when Jasmine Crockett made her next move, not to retaliate, but to reveal. Her voice softened, yet somehow carried more weight than ever. "Some people talk about poverty like it's a theory," she said, turning slightly toward the audience. "Let me introduce you to someone who lived it." She gestured to the second row, where an elderly black woman rose with quiet dignity. Dolores Holloway, wrapped in a navy wool coat and sturdy church shoes, stepped forward with a careful grace, like someone who had stood through too many winters without heat. The room grew still as she approached the microphone, clutching her purse like a lifeline. "My name is Dolores," she began, her voice fragile but unwavering. "Without Medicare, I would have died of untreated diabetes in 2009. Without a housing voucher, I would have been on the street after my husband passed." A flicker of emotion crossed her face. Not weakness, but memory. "I'm not lazy. I worked 2 jobs my whole life. But when life broke me, it was those programs that kept me breathing." She paused, then delivered the final line like a truth long denied: "They didn't give me luxury. They gave me a chance to stay alive." There was no applause. Just breath held still. Eyes locked. A silence that begged not to be broken. Crockett stepped back beside her, eyes steady, not triumphant, but resolute. Then, with surgical precision, Kimberly Klacik leaned into her mic. "That's one story," she said, voice cool, almost sterile. She adjusted her blazer, her expression unreadable. "A compelling one, sure. But statistically, the words sliced through the room like a scalpel." An aide activated the screen behind her, and a video bloomed to life. A smiling black girl in a crisp school uniform, reciting a poem from memory. The banner read, "Zariah, age 10, voucher recipient, first in her family to read at grade level." The chamber, seconds ago wrapped in sorrow, now flickered with applause and optimism. Laughter floated from the speakers. Zariah, bright and unburdened. Klacik turned back toward the panel, her voice sharp as she delivered the contrast: "You see, we can talk about survival, or we can talk about success." The impact was instantaneous. The room split clean down the middle. Half rose in a burst of applause. The other half froze in the weight of what had just been dismissed. Behind Crockett, Ms. Holloway remained at the microphone, her eyes lowered but her presence unshaken. Her lived reality had just been measured against a polished clip. And somewhere between the two, the chamber fractured, not just in opinion, but in belief. What the system offered wasn't just help or harm. It was a stage, and tonight every life story was just another exhibit. The applause faded into a jagged silence, one that didn't resolve, but festered, splitting the chamber not just ideologically, but emotionally. It was no longer a debate. It was an excavation. And Kimberly Klacik knew it. She didn't wait for permission. She seized the floor like a strategist claiming high ground. Leaning forward with slow precision, she placed both hands on the desk and locked eyes with Jasmine Crockett. Her tone dipped into disdain, her delivery almost theatrical. "You call that a system of help," she said, voice slicing through the room with surgical calm. I call it a gilded cage. A pause, long enough for the metaphor to coil. You feed people just enough to keep them quiet. Just enough to keep them dependent. That's not liberation. It's management. The words came like piano wire, tight, thin, lethal. You keep people inside just long enough for their children to inherit the same poverty. You polish the bars and tell them they're free. Some in the audience nodded cautiously, as if afraid to be seen agreeing. Others sat frozen, staring at Crockett, waiting for the response. But Klacik wasn't finished. She leaned back with the poise of someone who had rehearsed not just her argument, but its aftermath. That's not empowerment. That's entrapment. That's not justice. That's control. It wasn't just a statement. It was a dare. Jasmine Crockett's silence in the seconds that followed wasn't weakness. It was ignition. Her eyes didn't blink. Her hands didn't move. But when she spoke, her voice cut deeper than any insult that had come before. The system you're defending, she said, each word deliberate, is the real cage. The kind without a door. The kind where black voices don't echo. She stepped slightly away from the microphone, not for drama, but for clarity. Then she turned and gestured to the side. A quiet command. Her aide tapped the console, and suddenly the chamber filled with an eerie glow as the screen lit up, not with statistics, but with scars. It was a color-coded map from the 1930s. Government issued. Unmistakable. Red line zones burned across the cityscape. Areas labeled hazardous, not because of crime, but because of skin color. It was the original blueprint of exclusion. This isn't metaphor, Crockett said, her voice rising, tightening, not with anger, but with memory. This is history. She took a step forward, away from her seat, the screen looming behind her like an indictment. It's called redlining. It's how banks denied black families mortgages. How generational wealth was strangled before it could ever begin. Her tone cracked, not from weakness, but from pressure. She pointed at one of the red blocks on the map. These neighborhoods were abandoned by banks, ignored by insurers, stripped of investment, and then, decades later, called failures by the very people who made them unlivable. She turned to the gallery now, where journalists, parents, and policy aides leaned forward, riveted. The neighborhoods they starved of investment are the same ones you now call broken. Her voice turned sharp, iron-edged. So when I talk about systems, I'm not talking about charity. I'm talking about a machine that was built to keep us quiet. She let the words hang. Not a whisper moved through the chamber. Klacik's face remained composed, but her silence betrayed calculation. Crockett didn't wait for a reaction. She knew the weight of what she had just placed in the room. It was heavier than politics. It was heavier than policy. It was truth carved into real streets, real homes, real people who never got their start because they were never meant to. The room pulsed with the wake of two competing realities, one defined by self-reliance, the other by systemic sabotage. But Crockett wasn't finished. She wasn't making a point. She was opening a wound that had never closed. And now the whole chamber had to look. No one could claim ignorance. Not anymore. Not with the map still glowing in red behind her. Not with the air thick with something older than argument. Reckoning. The glow of the red line maps had barely faded from the chamber walls when Jasmine Crockett advanced toward the microphone again, this time not as a legislator, but as a witness. Her voice was lower now, not because it lacked power, but because what she carried into the room didn't need to be shouted. You want to talk about cages, she asked, her tone leveled like a scalpel about to cut. Let's talk about the ones we built for our own heroes. She reached for the next slide, and the screen shifted with a quiet flicker. A photo appeared, grainy, real, unfiltered. A black man sat on a weathered bus stop bench, military duffel bag at his feet, his head bowed against the cold. The caption beneath it read, "Veteran evicted, denied housing voucher." The silence that followed was heavier than anything the audience had yet absorbed. This man served 2 tours in Iraq, she said, her voice anchoring every word. Came home with injuries, medals, and no roof over his head. He didn't lose his way. This country lost him. Crockett stepped aside slightly, allowing the image to dominate the room like a ghost that refused to be buried. Black veterans returned to the U.S. with trauma, debt, and chronic illness. Yet instead of shelter, we give them a waiting list. Instead of security, we give them bureaucracy. Her eyes swept the crowd. We can fund every drone, every contract, every weapon in our arsenal. But somehow there's never room in the budget for a bed. Then, sharper now, we can fund the weapons, but we abandon the warriors. It was no longer a hearing. It was a funeral for promises broken in silence. Kimberly Klacik waited just long enough for the pain to register before striking. She didn't rise. She didn't adjust her tone. She didn't have to. Instead, she exhaled through her nose, the sound thin and cutting, then tilted her head with a smile so faint it burned. "You're a good lawyer, Jasmine," she said smoothly, eyes narrowed. "But you're a bad politician, because you don't believe black people can succeed without filling out a benefits application first." The sentence landed like a steel dart coated in sugar but aimed at the throat. It was personal. And designed to be. The crowd recoiled slightly, some from the shock of hearing it out loud, others from the cruel satisfaction behind it. Klacik didn't flinch. She leaned back in her chair with the poise of someone who had just fired a shot through the heart of her opponent's cause. It wasn't just an insult. It was a full rejection of everything Crockett stood for: compassion, policy, historical context reduced to a single dismissive caricature. Crockett didn't move. She didn't even blink. But the silence that surrounded her now was not defeat. It was the sound of a storm tightening behind her rib cage, waiting for the moment to break. The sting of Klacik's last strike still hung in the air like a slow-burning fuse. But Jasmine Crockett didn't retreat. She didn't raise her voice, didn't pace, or flare with outrage. Instead, she moved with terrifying calm, like someone who had stopped arguing and started proving. Her hand hovered above the desk console, and the room felt like it exhaled in unison, sensing something heavier was about to land. Her voice didn't crack. It carved. "You want to talk about dependency," she said, eyes fixed not on Klacik, but on the nation watching through lenses and live streams. "Then listen to what it sounds like when a system fails in real time." She pressed a button. A low hiss filled the speakers. Then the voice of a woman, tired, trembling, breaking. "Asterisk please, my son hasn't slept in 4 nights. He's hearing voices again. They told me the new insurance doesn't cover his meds anymore. They said to wait. I can't wait. He's not safe. I don't know what to do." Asterisk. There were no names. No locations. No dramatic music or graphics. Just a mother's voice, raw, cracking between desperation and dread. The sound wrapped around the chamber like a shroud, cutting deeper than any data ever could. Crockett didn't look away. Neither did the room. Even the camera seemed to pause. "That mother lives in my district," she said, stepping forward. Her voice was heavy with restraint, every syllable bracing the weight of a system she knew too well. Her son didn't need a charter school. He didn't need bootstrap speeches or budget graphs. He needed help. He needed care. He needed to be seen. She gestured to the corner of the screen where a simple caption read, "Call logged, February 12th, 3:34 a.m. Her voice darkened. But what he got was a phone tree. A rejection. A windowless waiting room. And a cold, bureaucratic smile that said, "Come back next month." Her eyes didn't flicker, but the anger beneath them was seismic. This is not a hypothetical. This is the cost of pretending that the American dream is available by invitation only. The silence that followed was almost sacred, until Klacik shattered it with precision. She didn't raise her voice either. She didn't need to. Her words came as steady as glass. "If that child had been in a charter school run by his own community," she said, her tone calculated, almost emotionless, "he wouldn't need insurance because he'd have real education instead." Gasps cracked across the room, followed immediately by a smattering of applause from her side of the gallery. Her delivery didn't flinch. "You want to talk about systems? How about one where that boy isn't broken by the time he's 12? Where teachers see him as a scholar, not a diagnosis?" Her gaze swept the audience, knowing full well she had thrown gasoline into a room lined with emotion. You build stronger children by giving them stronger choices, not by trapping their parents in waiting rooms. It wasn't just a counterpoint. It was a reframing. In her world, the problem wasn't neglect. It was the choice to depend. The failure to opt out. The audience fractured like glass under pressure. Some rose, clapping, their faces lit with a kind of righteous fury. Others sat stiff as statues, their jaws clenched, their eyes burning toward the front of the chamber. Reporters leaned into their devices, dictating headlines into recorders. Analysts whispered into handheld mics, rehearsing how they'd spin the clip before it even ended. On social media, the feed erupted. #BootstrapRescue began to trend before Crockett even moved again. But in that moment, she didn't. She stood still, like a mountain holding its breath, because beneath all the performance, all the sound and spectacle, a line had been drawn between the cry of a mother at 2 a.m. and the applause for a solution that did not answer her call. Crockett wasn't just debating a policy anymore. She was fighting for the right to name pain without being mocked for needing help. And Klacik wasn't just challenging the policy's effectiveness. She was questioning whether people like that mother, like that boy, like millions more, deserve to be helped at all, unless they earned it the right way. The air in the room was thick, not just with ideology, but with a silent, unbearable question: when did survival become a test of character? The room broke apart like a fault line after a quake. Chairs scraping, cameras scrambling, aides rushing into whispered clusters. Yet Jasmine Crockett moved through the chaos as if walking underwater. The moderator's call for recess had been clinical, but what it left behind was anything but. She didn't join the small huddle of Democratic staffers offering talking points, nor did she engage with the press who hovered nearby with half-formed questions. Instead, she stepped quietly toward the back of the chamber, past the exits, and into the shadowed space just beyond the camera's reach. There, beneath a tall, frosted window framed in brass, she sat alone on a worn leather bench, her back straight but her shoulders heavy with something unspeakable. From her blazer, she drew out a photo, folded twice, fraying at the creases, then opened it with care, like it was something sacred. The image was grainy, but it didn't need clarity to hurt. A woman, eyes red and swollen, sat on the edge of a cracked stoop. Eviction notice still in hand. A bundled infant clinging to her hip. Behind her, garbage bags lay piled beside scattered furniture. A broken tricycle leaned against the railing. Crockett stared into that face for a long moment, jaw tight, breath shallow. That woman wasn't a symbol. And she wasn't a prop. She was real. A voter. A survivor. A casualty. Crockett remembered the call that had come months earlier, the voice choked by shame, asking what to do when the rent relief vanished and the baby formula ran out in the same week. She had brought her story into the chamber today. And in return, half the room had shrugged. Or worse, applauded her opponent. Around her, the buzz of reporters floated like static electricity. But she didn't look up. This silence wasn't a retreat. It was a reservoir. She hadn't come to win a sound bite. She had come to expose a truth so ugly it couldn't be denied, only ignored. Just across the aisle, a very different scene was unfolding under the cold, controlled hum of stage lights. Fox News had already set up shop beside the grand marble pillar near the chamber door. A camera blinked to life. The makeup artist gave a final swipe of powder. Kimberly Klacik took her place in front of the lens, crossing one leg over the other with the precision of someone who'd done this dance before. She didn't fumble with notes. She didn't rehearse. She didn't need to. The lines were already etched. The producer whispered, rolling, and counted down with fingers. Klacik's smile came instantly, measured, practiced, meteor-ready. "This isn't about sympathy," she said, her tone steady, her gaze unblinking beneath lashes dusted with perfect mascara. "This is about truth." Her hand gestured behind her toward the hearing room that still vibrated with confrontation. What we heard today wasn't just emotional. It was manipulative. She leaned in slightly, giving the illusion of intimacy. The real crisis isn't poverty. It's the refusal to demand excellence from our communities. The anchor on the other side nodded, already mocking the segment's viral potential. Graphics slid across the screen, tough love or just the truth, no mention of veterans denied housing. No mention of broken mothers whispering into static at 2 a.m. In this version of reality, policy was performance. And Klacik had delivered hers flawlessly. Crockett remained out of frame, seated in silence, holding that photograph like a promise she refused to let this country break. And between them, floating through the air like invisible gunpowder, was the unspoken truth: in the war between cruelty and clarity, compassion rarely made the cut for airtime. The second half of the hearing opened not with fire, but with clarity sharpened into a spear. Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat, no longer just a voice for the forgotten, but now a vessel of grim arithmetic carrying the weight of a system that had done its math in blood. "Let's talk numbers," she began, her voice no longer seeking consensus, but indicting silence itself. She moved with precision, opening a dark leather folder and unfurling a printed chart. Each statistic etched like a scar. When Texas refused to expand Medicaid, over 1.4 million people lost access to basic health care. That's not a projection. That's a verdict. One handed down by people who saw spreadsheets where I see human lives. She held up a map marked with crimson blotches representing counties now classified as medical deserts, areas where clinics had closed, wait times had doubled, and uninsured rates had reached crisis levels. Behind her, the images flicked across the monitors: long lines outside mobile clinics, handwritten signs on shuttered hospital doors, gravestones with birth dates far too recent. Her voice didn't shake. It dropped into something darker, more lethal. "I've met mothers who ration insulin. I've buried veterans who couldn't refill their prescriptions. And still they tell us this is fiscal responsibility. No. It's cruelty wrapped in budgetary jargon. And it's killing my constituents." The chamber fell into a hush that wasn't reverence. It was fear. The kind of fear that comes when a politician stops trying to win and starts telling a truth too jagged to spin. But Klacik wasn't rattled. She stood slowly, deliberately, brushing a lock of hair from her shoulder like brushing off an accusation. Her expression was poised. Too poised. The kind you wear when you've already rehearsed this moment in front of a camera, not a mirror. "Let's talk solutions," she said, sliding an iPad from her folder and tapping the screen with manicured ease. The monitor behind her shifted, now flashing bright images of students in matching blazers, young black children smiling from the steps of private schools. While Texas played politics, she continued, voice smooth as glass, "I launched Let Baltimore Rise. We gave hundreds of black students the chance to escape failing public schools through private scholarship programs, funded not by government, but by people who actually believe in potential." She turned slightly toward Crockett, not with hostility, but with something colder, casual dismissal dressed as civility. "It's what belief looks like. Not dependency. Not statistics. Just results." And just like that, the narrative shifted. A campaign video disguised as rebuttal. A spotlight redirecting grief into success. Stories neatly packaged for prime time. The reaction was instant. A murmur moved through the audience. Some captivated by the sheen of her presentation. Others rigid with discomfort. The camera zoomed in, feeding the illusion that two sides had presented equal truths. But in the back of the room, where no iPad slideshow could reach, a mother's voicemail still echoed in silence. And in Crockett's clenched jaw was the knowledge that real justice rarely photographs well. The storm didn't end with the final gavel strike. It simply changed platforms. As the last audience members filed out of the Capitol hearing room and the lights dimmed over empty microphones, the world beyond the chamber surged to life. Screens lit up. Notifications pinged like incoming rounds. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, and live-stream panels flared into motion, their digital engines roaring with conflict, praise, mockery, and myth-making. No one had expected a congressional debate on social welfare to rip through the internet like this. But now it was in the bloodstream of America's divided soul. The clips came first, cut down to 6-minute firestorms and one-line kill shots. Jasmine Crockett rising from her seat, voice heavy with fury and grace, "Don't call poverty a choice when you've rigged every door shut." Her face, framed in a still image, was now plastered across news thumbnails. Commentators called her the Angela Davis of the 21st century, not merely because of her politics, but because she had made injustice bleed on the floor of power without raising her voice above a cold, deliberate calm. That moment when she held up the eviction notice of a single mother and forced the camera to linger on it became a symbol, not just of policy failure, but of what it means to carry pain into rooms built for indifference. Yet in another corner of the digital world, Kimberly Klacik had seized a different kind of spotlight. Her polished tone, her measured words, Her PowerPoint-perfect statistics were replayed and recut by conservative commentators and influencers who proclaimed her the Harriet Tubman of the right. On one podcast, a host declared, "She's not leading people to freedom through a forest. She's leading them out of ideological slavery, from welfare to worth." Her now famous line, "not dependency, not statistics, just results," was stitched onto t-shirts, tweeted by congressional aides, and praised by billionaire donors who saw in her performance a vision of reform that didn't require introspection. What erupted was no longer a political debate. It was cultural territory warfare. Opinion writers scrambled to define the moment. Was Crockett demanding justice or selling resentment? Was Klacik offering liberation or disguising austerity in pearls and lipstick? In the span of 12 hours, both women had been raised onto digital pedestals by their supporters and gutted by their detractors. For every article that praised Crockett as a reluctant prophet of systemic repair, there was another that accused her of emotional grandstanding. For every post celebrating Klacik's scholarships and self-reliance doctrine, there were viral threads dissecting her dismissal of the elderly veteran or the mother whose voice cracked on that desperate call for mental health support. And yet, beneath the media spin, something deeper vibrated, uncomfortable, raw. The internet had not created this rift. It had only amplified it. Across barbershops, classrooms, living rooms, and boardrooms, people were asking a question they hadn't wanted to ask for years: what exactly does empowerment look like for Black America? Is it collective uplift or individual escape? Who gets to define resilience, those who survive, or those who refuse to need survival at all? That night, on the After Midnight Report, the tension reached its emotional zenith. The host, a former civil rights attorney turned commentator, stared into the lens as if it were a mirror, his voice low and charged. "What we saw today wasn't two Black women debating policy," he said. "It was two Americas screaming through them. And neither one walked away clean." He leaned forward. "Let me be clear. Black folks don't need rescue missions. They don't need pity tours or social media saviors. What they need, what they have always needed, is trust. Trust that they can lead. Trust that they can rise. Trust that they can disagree without being erased." The studio audience, silent up until that point, broke into applause. Not wild. Not theatrical. But deep, aching, human. It wasn't about which woman had won. It wasn't even about welfare or school vouchers anymore. It was about the wound behind the argument, the wound of being spoken for rather than being believed. Back online, the discourse continued into the early hours. Crockett's team released a short statement reaffirming her commitment to expanding access to health care and housing, while subtly calling out the danger of reducing generational pain to a debate club exercise. Klacik, in turn, posted a video thanking her supporters and re-emphasizing her mission to create opportunity, not dependence. The comment sections beneath both posts became battlegrounds of philosophy, identity, and rage. Parents shared their stories, some saying government aid saved their families, others claiming it stole their drive. Veterans wrote in. So did teachers, nurses, grocery workers. A blizzard of truth. It was no longer a policy debate. It was the moral reckoning of a nation split by the myth of self-sufficiency. And somewhere in Washington, D.C., as the sun began to rise, Jasmine Crockett sat at her desk, not scrolling, not reacting, but writing. Not a tweet. Not a statement. But a memo. Legislation. A line.